Now, it is, as we've already mentioned, Holy Week, and the cover of The Spectator speaks to that. It's our Easter special with some beautiful Easter lilies there on it. And the lead piece is about the fact that it's been a decade now of Archbishop Welby being Archbishop of Canterbury and Pope Francis being Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. I'm joined now by Dan Hitchens, who is the senior editor of First Things, and Andrew Doyle, who is a writer, comedian, and TV presenter for GB News, and also the author of this excellent book, The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. Dan, you've written this piece about Welby and Pope Francis, and it's funny that they both became leaders within days of each other, within 8 days of each other, I think, back in 2013. And when they were, as you say in the piece, when they were appointed, when elevated, they were hailed as unifiers that might sort of bring their churches together. And in fact, as you spell out quite clearly, the opposite has happened, has it not?
It has. And, well, to start with, Justin Welby, being Archbishop of Canterbury, is notoriously the worst job in the world because there are such stark divisions within the Church of England. But it's remarkable just this year how contentious those divisions have become. So in February, the Church of England's Parliament, the General Synod, voted to introduce blessings for same-sex couples, which for many people looks like a step towards an accommodation with same-sex marriage, obviously a very, very divisive issue. And the Evangelical Council, who represent the very important evangelical wing, have said they feel compelled to resist this, that if it goes ahead, they'll declare that it's contrary to the scriptures, about as serious a claim as you could make. Internationally as well, you have other Anglican leaders who aren't part of the Church of England, but recognise the Church of England as their mother church, who've issued a joint statement saying we can no longer see the Church of England as a mother church or give Justin Welby a sort of special preeminence as the leader among us leaders. And then as well as these big statements, there are remarkable things happening at the local level where you have churches in London, for instance, two of the best known big thriving churches have said they're going to suspend their standard payments to the Diocese of London because they feel so out of sorts with their bishop who supported this change. You have a big church in Oxford which has said the bishop can't come to receive communion here or preach here. So these are remarkable steps. It's not just disagreement, not even the kind of very sharp arguments we've seen, but something very close to a breaking of unity. And, you know, as you mentioned in your intro, 10 years ago, Justin Welby was hailed as the man who could unite the different factions. He was a conservative, but he understood liberals. And, you know, if anyone could bring peace to the situation, it was him. So that's really the puzzle with which the piece starts, is how have we gone from 10 years of those very rosy hopes to the current extraordinarily divided situation.
And just before we get on to Pope Francis, you do have this bit in the piece where Welby has said he's extremely joyfully celebratory about same-sex blessings, but he won't do them himself, which is a sort of amazing bit of fence-sitting, is it not?
Yes, and there was a moment, I think last year, where he said on the subject of same-sex marriage more broadly, that he had a view but wouldn't express it publicly. So this is his attempt to be a leader, to say, you know, I have to represent and speak to congregations with vastly different views on this. This is my attempt to bring them together. It was a good encapsulation of his approach before he became Archbishop, just before, when he was asked, you know, you have people who think that having women bishops is completely impossible within the Anglican faith, and you have some people who think it's absolutely necessary, otherwise we're not real Christians. How do you square the circle? And he said, it's very simple. It's a circle with some sharp bits on it, which is a really good soundbite, but it's also sort of saying, I don't know how to make a statement that I think is true and that applies to this situation, maybe we can ride it out. And he hasn't been able to ride it out, even with his diplomatic and communicatory skills.
And let's just quickly sum up the problems in Pope Francis' pontificate. I mean, he's seen as divisive because he seems to pick fights with almost everyone within the Catholic Church, does he not?
Yes, I think there's something even more fundamental, which is that Catholics have enormous respect for the Pope as a teacher whose words carry enormous weight. And Pope Francis will make statements which are extremely confusing on really quite fundamental matters. He issued a document which was partly about very serious questions about marriage, about the Eucharist, the central sacrament of the Christian life. And it was very unclear what he was getting at. And some senior cardinals wrote him and said, could you clarify these points? And he didn't acknowledge the request, or he didn't want to meet them, didn't want to address it. And there have been probably dozens of examples where he's acted in that way, where people sort of look to him for spiritual guidance and he comes up with thoughts that could be interpreted in any number of ways. And I think there have also been episodes where he's intervened in communities, particularly recently with this crackdown on the Latin Mass, where basically it's now a lot harder for communities who want to have the liturgy in that form to have it, which have deepened those divisions. Once again, 10 years ago, an enormous wave of hope, a lot of press about how Pope Francis could get beyond these silly divisions between Christians and get down to what really mattered. And it turns out it's not that simple, that there's something much more serious in these divisions than perhaps almost anyone had understood at the time. And I think certainly these two leaders had understood, because that's been the story of their leadership, is it gradually emerging how contentious these issues is, how difficult it is to bring the sides together.
Andrew, I'll bring you in. Let me wave your book around. You wrote this book, The New Puritans, How the Religions of Social Justice Captured the Western World. Are you surprised to the extent to which religion, as in Europe's religion, Christianity, main religion, Christianity, has itself been captured by social justice?
This is one of the most surprising things. I mean, we've all become very accustomed to this new ideological movement infecting any institution it touches, whether that's in the media or the corporate world or even the judiciary or the police or the NHS. We've seen how it works. It infects everything it gets into. The surprise has been how readily it has been able to unveil its way into traditional Christian movements. I even spoke to an evangelical preacher from America, from a Baptist community, who was talking about how various of his colleagues are now running sessions on intersectional readings of the Bible. So even the most sort of fervent traditionalist movements or branches of Christianity don't seem to be immune to this particular movement. And I think this is why it is kind of unprecedented. I mean, Dan makes the very good point that it's always been the case. That there has been a struggle between conservative wings of various churches and the more progressive wings of various churches. And that's particularly the case in the Anglican Church because, of course, various, particularly in Africa, a lot of the bishops in Africa are inherently traditionalist and want to promote that idea and are now considering, obviously, a schism. And it's always been the case with Catholicism as well. But I think what is new and what is different is that this particular ideological movement is, by its nature, intolerant. I mean, Dan says in his article that progressivism has a religious fervour of its own. But I would add to that this is especially the case when you have a regressive movement that styles itself as progressive but is nothing of the sort. And that is what we're dealing with here. It isn't the sort of movement that will brook dissent. So in terms of squaring the circle, I don't think it's actually possible. I think it has to be one or the other.
And do you think, I mean, the religion of social justice is intolerant, as you say, and do you think that's where it gets its strength from? And that's why, to a certain extent, if there's a battle for souls going on, it's winning.
It will win because it's scary. because its practitioners have developed this thing which we colloquially call cancel culture. What that really means is bullying. What it means is if you don't subscribe to our views, we'll ruin your life, and they can be very scary people. So of course you end up with this situation where the Archbishop of Canterbury is having to sort of please everyone, because it's absolutely terrifying to go up against these kinds of activists who have made their way into the Anglican Church as well. In terms of the Pope, I suppose he has a slightly different situation, but every successive pope, whenever they contradict something a previous one has said, is in trouble because of the notion of papal infallibility. So often it comes down to fudging of the language, which is why you get this idea of squaring a circle, as Dan has pointed out. But the movement is impossible to resist in that respect, unless you are courageous, unless you are able to say, no, we have certain beliefs that are not compatible with your worldview. And remember that this ideology is a movement that really is about the negation of reality, the negation of truth. It has all the hallmarks of a religion of its own. It has its own esoteric language. It has its own foundational holy texts, such as those by the likes of Judith Butler and Michel Foucault. So you can't just expect it. It doesn't blend well with other institutions. It takes them over. It works more like a virus. And in that sense, the various churches, the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, could well do with a kind of inoculation, rather than this attempt to fudge it, an attempt to bring it in and claim that it's compatible. It absolutely is not.
Well, Dan, as Andrew suggests, isn't it quite a big opportunity for the Christian churches to resist the religion of social justice? Because, as you say in your piece, the elements of Christianity that are thriving tend to be conservative ones, and young people tend to be drawn towards more conservative forms of Christianity, probably or possibly because it offers an antidote to this negation of reality, to this sort of total postmodernism when it comes to truth, that they're offered everywhere else.
It's definitely the story of our times that the divisions are sharpening in politics and in fundamental questions like, what is the difference between men and women, on which, it's very hard to claim, though people will try to claim that, the Christian tradition can be reconciled with what is now increasingly the fashionable view. So I think that is one area where you can see that trying to unify progressivism and Christianity is probably not going to work. There has to be a confrontation at some point. And as you say, people who've grown up in the last 30 years are quite likely to recognize that. And I think that's why you find it is often the younger believers who are more conservative, which can seem paradoxical to people who remember the 60s. But someone like Kate Forbes, the SNP leadership candidate as was, who got in trouble for her views on same-sex marriage and premarital sex and so on, 33 years old. She's in some ways quite representative of that younger generation of believers who are kind of unembarrassed, know where they stand, and definitely stand with a more traditional conservative view.
And you mentioned this fascinating thesis of Richard Rex, the Cambridge historian, who says there's three reformations. The first was what is God, the second is what is church, and the one we're living through at the moment is what is man, or I suppose what is woman, might be the current question. How does that apply to what you're talking about in terms of Welby and Francis?
I think I'd go back to what I was saying, that in 2013, very few people realised how big this crisis was. There was a sense of, well, we're Christians, we all believe that God is love, we all believe in helping the poor, we all want to be united. Maybe we can put on aside these kind of arguments which aren't that essential about sexuality and gender and so on. But actually those arguments are about human nature. And this is the Richard Rex analysis you mentioned, that the history of Christianity has three big crises in it. One of them about the nature of God, when you have, mobs storming the churches of bishops, trying to assassinate them because they've got the wrong view on how many persons there are in the Trinity. The Reformation is obviously another big crisis over the nature of the church. And we're now living through an upheaval which is as big as those and could go on for as long, which is about what is it to be a human being, basically. And we're a long way from resolving that question or resolving these debates. So I don't think we should expect any unity anytime soon.
But Andrew, where there is possible or where there are possible unities, is between strands of liberalism that have for decades been viciously opposed to Christian teaching and seen Christianity as very backwards and regressive, and let's say the Christian churches. I mean, there's Mary Harrington, someone like that, is an interesting writer who writes about reactionary feminism, and that actually a lot of liberals who are kind of being mugged by wokery, as it were, are now forming alliances with Christians and with Christian thinking on ideas of truth and so on.
Well, yes, because we often forget that the Christian churches in our contemporary time have been liberalised rather successfully. I mean, long gone are the days where the Catholic Church taught that if you were gay, you should be burnt at the stake and you are essentially evil and demonic. You know, in the Catechism, it talks about, yes, it's an intrinsic moral disorder, but it is not the case that someone who is inherently attracted to members of their own sex is evil. That is accepted amongst Catholic teaching as being a state of nature, something that is part of their being. It is the act. And of course, the Catholic Church has always taught that any sex act outside of wedlock is sinful anyway. So it isn't a kind of anti-gay thing. And the Church has liberalised and attitudes have changed. But what you have now is a movement that sort of seizes the mantle of liberalism and claims to be progressive. And it's nothing of the kind. It's actually closer akin to the kind of intolerant elements of church teaching that the Church has moved beyond and has left behind. So that's where you're going to get this conflict. Fundamentally, modern day Christianity has at its heart the notion of forgiveness and repentance, ideas which are completely alien to the contemporary religion of social justice. Those are things that they don't believe in. They believe in cruelty and viciousness as a means to coerce people into going along with their worldview. I cannot see how that could possibly sit side by side with Christian teaching. Plus the fact, as you've mentioned, so many young people are coming up and are attracted to the traditionalism of the Church. That was the whole appeal of both the Church of England and the Catholic Church, is it's rooted in tradition. And that is something that is going to appeal more and more to young people who are going to react against. I mean, let's not forget that the religion of social justice is largely propagated by people of my age, by millennials and Gen X. These people are old now. Millennials, they're in their 40s, right? So younger people are going to react against it. And then you've also got the insurpassable obstacle, I think, that some of the teachings of the religion of social justice are just fundamentally at odds with Christian teachings, particularly when it comes to gender. When you have this idea there is a gendered soul that we all have that is at odds with our body, that cannot possibly sit with biblical teaching. It doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. And so I come back to this point. I just think reconciliation is impossible. The conflict you mentioned is coming, and it can't come too soon.
And Dan, I used to work at the Catholic Herald, which you edited, and we used to do quite a lot of stories on ecumenism, the sort of coming together of Anglicanism with Catholicism, to bringing together the two churches. That's not really on anyone's priorities at the moment within Christianity, is it? Because both the Anglican Communion and the Catholic Church are so busily fighting each other.
True to some extent, but I think all the things we're talking about mean, people discovering new enemies, they also discover new friendships. So I do expect to see more conversations and perhaps more kind of unlikely alliances and interesting agreements between Catholics and Anglicans who, agree about the nature of marriage, even if they have very fundamental disagreements about, other questions, the Eucharist or the nature of authority in the church. And I think those conversations are starting to happen. So this is yet another example of the upheaval that we're living through, and that's got a long way to run yet.
Well, Dan and Andrew, I think we'll end it there, but a very happy Easter to both of you.